I'm going to start today by telling you a story. So my father was a humble Singapore Chinese immigrant shopkeeper. And in 1987, he dreamed not of living the American dream, but of living the Australian dream, which you can probably tell by my accent. So he bundled my mother, my sister, and I all together, and he moved us to Perth in Western Australia. And there, because he had no education beyond high school, like many immigrants, he bought us a small shop, a news agency. Do you remember in the 90s, news agencies, we sold paper and pens and Archie comics, which I loved, Teen Idol magazines. Now, I was very bad at maths. I still am not great. You guys have a lot to teach me about that. So in order for me to be better at maths, my mother would make me shadow my dad in that shop every school holidays and count back change to customers, hoping I would get better. What she didn't count on was the fact that the minute my dad could hear the beads of gravel unfurl themselves around the tires of her car reversing out of that shopping center driveway, my dad would come up to me, he'd tap me on the shoulder. Hey, darling, it's okay. You can step back. And I would sit on the carpet, cross-legged, with that Archie comic and a Coke from the mini fridge, and read. But like any 9-year-old, 4 hours into the 8-hour day, I would get bored, and then I would look up and watch my dad connect with his customers. Now, this is a guy who literally showed up 7 days a week, 8 hours a day, for 20 years till the day he died of cancer, not making it to his retirement. He showed up and he created human connection magic within the 3D box that he was trapped behind of that shop counter, which is not unlike the box that we have found ourselves trapped behind in virtual communication over the last 2 years. But more on that in a moment. So the first customer would come in, a Malaysian man, a new immigrant to Australia, maybe 4 years. And I would watch as my dad would thicken his Asian accent. He would throw words of Chinese into the conversation, and his body would morph. He would lean casually down at his hips, and his paunch would be over the top of his belt like ripe Christmas pudding covered in white polo shirt. And the two men would debate back and forth, which country, Singapore or Malaysia, had the best laksa. Do you know what laksa is here? It's a delicious noodle dish, and if you're ever in my part of the world, I would take you to have some. And they would debate which country had the best. 30 seconds later, this man would walk out, another man would walk in, a German immigrant, this time 30 years in Australia. My dad's body would change. He would match this man's upright gait. He would neutralize his Asian accent, not to pretend he was posh or something that he wasn't, but to be understood. And the two men would talk about the Eurovision Song Contest. Does anyone know what the Eurovision Song Contest is? Yes, thank you. If you don't know, it's an American Idol-style contest where countries across Europe put forward a song and then one country comes out the winner. It's important for later in the story. 30 seconds later, this German customer would move and a British customer would come in. This man, 45 years in Australia. And here, my dad would go quiet and he wouldn't talk very much and he would just listen. And my 9-year-old jaw dropped because this British man was disclosing not just the everyday, how are you, would you like a packet of cigarettes? He was disclosing his deepest, darkest trauma to his local shopkeeper. He was an orphan from the north of England that was brought over in something called the Home Children's Scheme. And this happened in Canada as well, where these orphans were brought in and went through a lot of neglect and abuse in order to get their residency for the country. And I just thought, what spell had my dad cast over these people that they would feel so comfortable with him? And what that magic was is rapport. Rapport is where other people perceive us to be more like them. And it goes back to the science of human connection. When we were out living on the savannah as early people, as tribespeople, our brains quickly acquainted that there was safety in numbers. If we were with our tribe, there was more support. So if we were pregnant and slowing everyone down, the other women in the tribe would gather berries and feed us. If we were out on the hunt and we were injured, the other men in the tribe would spear game, bring it back and feed us. And at night, when we slept, different people would take turns keeping watch to make sure that we got our sleep. To this day, if we are cast out of that tribe, socially distant, lonely, our body has a fight or flight response that undermines our well-being, shortens our lifespan, and leads to a whole host of both mental and physical illness. So human connection is really, really good for us. And when we recognize people from our tribe, we feel closer to them. And that builds trust. Trust is the cornerstone of connection. And now you're all realtors, so you know people buy from people they know, like, and trust. So rapport is the first of 4 building blocks today of human connection that I'll share. And rapport is what we use when we first meet someone, a new contact. I think of it as like tenderizing the meat. Sorry to any vegans here. It's like tenderizing the meat before marination, okay? It's the first step. So how did my dad do it? I'm going to break it down into steps now. The first thing he did was he spoke to people like they spoke to him. So when you meet a brand new prospect, match them in terms of speed, tone, volume. People here bilingual in this room? Anybody bilingual? Great. If you meet a new prospect whose first language is your second language, you can drop some words in like what my dad did. He was in that moment saying to that Malaysian man, hey, I know I've been in Australia 10 years and I'm raising my children here, but hey, my Asian brother, you and I are still part of the same tribe. We're still more alike than you think. So use that. Tap into the volume, the energy somebody speaks at. Speak to them like they speak to you. Point number 2 for building rapport. Speak to people about the things they like to speak about. Remember I mentioned the Eurovision, the song contest? Now that baffled me because my dad would rather talk about golf. He would have loved the win, and also about us kids. He didn't. Why would he be interested in a song contest? Yet every year he would make me stay up late European time with him and sit there as he cracked hot chestnuts into my hand. We would be waiting for the winner of this contest. And it's only as an adult that I realized the stakes for him were so high. He had to make sales to maintain his residency, and having content to connect with his clients with allowed him to make those sales. It would keep the hot chestnut in my hand, the rice bowl in my stomach, and the overpriced private school uniform on my back. So he did it. So speak to people like they speak to you, and talk to them about the things that they want to talk about. When you first meet a contact, put aside your desire to talk about the things you're interested in. Let them speak. The third thing that is really important was my father used his body. Now, I mentioned to you, he was pinned, severed at the waist by that countertop, like so many immigrant shopkeepers we've all seen, 7 days a week. He didn't get out much, but he made magic with his upper body. And why mirroring is really powerful is when we see somebody move their body the way we move our body, our brain goes, oh, they're like me. We're part of that same tribe. If they express the way that I express, well, we're alike. And that is so powerful in a hugely polarized world when people see themselves in you. So the other reason mirroring is important is to do with trust. Now, trust is part of building connection. And what we know is the first thing that people do when they meet a stranger is they don't glance at their eyes or their mouth. They glance at their hands. Did you know that? Okay, well now we know. Communications expert Vanessa Van Edwards found out that the world's most watched TED Talks are the ones with the most hand gestures. And this is to do with the fact when we were back as tribespeople on that savannah, if we were to come across a stranger from a foreign tribe, the first thing we would do would be, they had their hands behind their back, as possibly a weapon that could hurt us. It made us trust them less. If I was to do my whole speech to you right now with my hands behind my back, you wouldn't trust me as much. Your subconscious would be like, what is Simone hiding? So we want to build trust, and this is both for in-person and for on virtual. I even heard social media before. I use a lot of video for social media. Having your frame for any virtual conferencing that you have with a potential client in another city maybe, having it framed out, and remembering my dad, that counter at the waist, make sure the bottom of your laptop screen touches the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the bit of triangular muscle in between your rib cage. Let's all find that right now. So your ribs are here, and there's that little triangle of muscle. For the singers in here, yours is going to be stronger than the rest of us. That is where you should try and line up the bottom of the frame of your laptop so your hands are in shot. If they're under on your lap, it's the equivalent of standing on stage and doing that speech with your hands behind your back. So digital body language, in-person body language, and mirroring that client is really important. So if you were to meet and they look like they had a down day, body posture's not good, you wouldn't meet up with them and be like, hi, I'm here, how are you? It would show that you weren't resonant with where they're at and that you are not alike. We want to be alike, we want to match that body posture at first and then bring them out into good rapport. And naturally good human connectors do this innately, but it's something to be reminded of. So, rapport is our first pillar, and the three things are: speak to people like they speak to you, talk to them about the things they like to speak about, and mirror their body language. The next pillar of human connection is commonalities connect. It's basically finding points of relatability between you and that person. So you've had rapport, tenderize the meat a little bit, and we're bringing you through the process now of getting closer and building even more trust. Now, finding commonalities, priming ourselves to look at how we are alike with people in a polarized world is so powerful. I have a book coming up which Chris mentioned, and in the book I feature a case study, a lady called Christina Sang, who I met when I was first living in Dubai. And Christina was the head of events at the Burj Khalifa, the Armani Hotel, the world's tallest hotel. And so she was dealing with like Arab royalty and Hollywood celebrities. Connection was literally her job. And I remember watching her one day and thinking, I have to find out this woman's story. So she was Korean in background, born and raised in Manila, did high school here in the US, hospitality school in Switzerland, where she met a Portuguese boyfriend, moved to Portugal with him, then went to Dubai where I met her, and she currently lives in Bali. And when she was living in Portugal, she went there, and like many foreign spouses, she didn't speak Portuguese, and after a while she got really, really bored of her boyfriend's friends, which I think is totally relatable, and she decided, look, I have to make my own friends. So she went to a nightclub, and she looked for the style of music, old school R&B. Who's an old school R&B fan? Oh my gosh, I'm so an old school R&B fan. Okay, so she knew already, commonality number one, everyone in this nightclub likes the same sort of music. She then went to the bathroom, she was touching up her makeup, listening for English speakers. She then went up to the English speakers and was like, oh, so we're all foreigners here in Lisbon. Do you like food? Who doesn't like food? Anyone here raise your hand if you don't like food? Yeah, we're all part of the same tribe. We're all part of the same tribe. So that was the next commonality. And before she knew it, she had a group of friends in Lisbon and she felt less alone. For people like Christina and I who've spent a lot of time, and Chris as well, living in different countries, our brains subconsciously know, hey, I'm alone in this new country. I need a tribe to keep me safe. I need to go out and connect. And that's how Christina got so good at it, because she always had to make a group of friends as quickly as possible wherever she was. Truly, truly a master at it. Recently, it happened to me. Somebody used Commonalities Connect on me, and it was also in Portugal, which I heard you have a leading RE global event there coming up as well. So I was in Portugal in December, And there has not been many people who look like me as tourists in Europe for a couple of years now because of this thing called a pandemic. You might have heard of it. And so there was not many Asian tourists around. And we were at this castle in the center of Lisbon, and they had these narrow stairs. It was not like Game of Thrones where there's a wide stairs and Jon Snow is battling with people. It was really narrow, and only one set of people could go up and one set of people could go down at a time. And so there was a line of 10 Asian tourists coming up the stairs, and I stood to the side wearing my mask and my cap, so all you can see is my eyes. And I'm wearing a t-shirt with Bruce Lee's face on it. And the guy at the front of the line goes, "Oh, Bruce Lee." And because it's the year 2022 and we do not want to assume where people are from in the year 2022, I didn't know. He could be Japanese, he could be Korean. I didn't want to say anything. So I said, "Oh, you know Bruce Lee? You know him?" And this guy said, "Yes, I am Chinese." And then, using what I mentioned earlier about rapport, I switched into Mandarin, which my Mandarin is terrible. Does anyone speak Mandarin in this crowd here today? Nice try, it's okay. I appreciate the support. So I said to him in really bad Mandarin, you know, my father is Singaporean Chinese. And this whole line of tourists was like, oh, there was this communal moment where we were like, we are part of the same tribe and we didn't even know it. And the last 2 years has been a bit rough for the East Asian community. So there was like a solidarity in that moment. And I realized if I or these people can walk through the world scanning for commonalities, how powerful and memorable that can make you. So it's as easy as this. If you're on a virtual conference call and the person is using a real background and not a virtual one, scan to see if there are any books on that bookshelf. Oh my God, you love Malcolm Gladwell? Love Malcolm Gladwell. My favorite book from his is Blink. If you are out and somebody is in a bar wearing the same sporting team that you love, wearing some of their kit, use that as that conversation opener. Condition yourself to have the commonalities connects mindset, scanning for how you are alike as opposed to different. So we've now done rapport, commonalities connect, and we're moving into the third pillar, and this is where you take connection from, and you've all, I'm sure, experienced this with your clients, that superficial transactional relationship, to that moment where your client actually asks you how you are and becomes your friend. Has anyone here had a client become a friend? Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I've had a few coaching clients become that with me, and it's really nice. And that has to do with something that you might find really a little bit scary. It's to do with vulnerability. If I say vulnerability to you in a corporate context, do you find that a bit scary? Thought of being vulnerable? Few nods. I mean, it definitely where I come from in Singapore, with the work culture there, that's absolutely petrifying to talk about being vulnerable. Vulnerability is any form of emotional disclosure. It's as easy as actually turning your video on video conference on as opposed to having it off. You're showing more emotional information for people to connect with. And I've had a really troubling relationship with vulnerability because I used to work in media. I was a radio DJ for 15 years. So every single month, like with a gun to my head, I had to disclose things about my life for entertainment value that I didn't necessarily want to. And what happened over the years was I would end up oversharing at dinner table parties and just thinking that that was normal because I was doing it 5 days a week for work. And what I can tell you for sure is vulnerability, this part of the 4 steps, before trust is established, is oversharing. So if we don't do rapport, commonalities connect, and we just go straight to vulnerability, it actually scares a potential client off more because it says to them, hey, I can't keep hold of my own secrets and my personal life, so I'm not going to be able to do that for you. And they become skeptical and they lack trust with you. So please use this powerful tool of vulnerability only after that trust is established. But once it is established, it's incredibly, incredibly powerful. For me, it's the one tool that really takes us to authentic connection from something that might be a little bit more surface level. And I'm going to use 2 examples here, one from my part of the world and one from North America. So Singapore, this tiny, super clean red dot that I live on, was founded by a guy called Lee Kuan Yew. And he was a super stoic Chinese man, like really not much emotion at all. He spoke with a crisp British accent because he was Cambridge educated. And he was also, in Singaporean terms, kind of privileged because he was Chinese as opposed to the other races that make up the country. And one day in 1965, there was a national TV broadcast. And I want you to imagine it's black and white and the sound is kind of crackly, and he's sitting on a couch and he's exhausted. Because for the last few weeks, he's been going back and forth with Malaysia. So Malaysia is our version of America, and Singapore would be Canada. It's like Australia and New Zealand, if I can paint that picture for you. Our bigger neighbor. And they were trying to create a unified state. And at that moment, his self-confessed adult dream was dashed. Malaysia didn't want Singapore to be part of them. And he sits on this national broadcast and he bursts into tears. This was just unheard of. But what it did was incredibly powerful. In that moment, he ceased to be his race, his gender, his class. He was no longer this person that was, very educated in Singapore for those days. He was just a human being who had been devastated because he felt he had let people that he loved down. And every single person in the country can understand what that feels like. The human part of human connection is that vulnerability. It's genderless, it's ethnicless. An example on the North American front of this. Okay, raise your hand, you all know the Monica Lewinsky scandal, correct? I was a kid in the 90s watching this unfold on Australian television, and I think there was such little understanding of her side of what had happened. And for years, there was no emotional disclosure from her. We never heard her side of the story, and she was painted as this kind of woman. And years later, decades later, she gets on the TED stage and she says she had to shower with the door open because her mother feared she would take her life. In that moment, we get to see the full picture of what it would be like to start your career in your 20s and possibly have no future because of a scandal like that, that's global. Your dating life is basically destroyed because everything is public. And how do you go on? When we didn't have the vulnerability of her side of the story, we had no idea, we couldn't relate. She was this thing. And then once we knew, we thought to ourselves, how many of us would have been any different to have our names dragged through the mud like that as our lives were just beginning? So vulnerability, what an absolute gift it is. And in the context of the work you do, it can be as simple as one day when one of your clients, who there is good trust and rapport with, asks you, how's your day going? And being open to giving the true answer. Oh, sales are really, really good right now, but to be honest, having a bit of an issue with my husband. Kids are playing up. Oh, my kid has to go to a specialist. They think he might have ADHD. It's as small as that, and I tell you, if that rapport and that trust is established, that client will reciprocate. More on reciprocity in just a moment. But to recap again, we've had rapport, commonalities connect, and then we've had vulnerability, and our very last of the 4 pillars that takes you to the highest level of fulfillment. Because human connection, it's not just about performing at work, it's not just about physical and mental well-being, it's what we need to feel fulfilled. The next component is service, being of service. I want to hop in the time machine with you, and I want to go back to that savannah. For us, the worst thing would be to be rejected from that tribe. We would have been susceptible to threats. We would probably have been killed off. To this day, as digitized as we are and virtually connected, that cave person brain still sits in our heads, and it seeks out connection, and it detects social rejection the same way we feel physical pain. And there are studies to back this up. That's why a broken heart, you can feel that pain in your chest. So what better way to prevent yourself from being kicked out of the tribe than to be indispensable to the tribe? Now, the tribe could be leading RE. It could be your particular organization. It could be your extended family or your community that you live in, your suburb. If you positively impact that tribe, not only do you feel really good, and we all know this, any of us who've ever been part of any sort of organized religion know this, doing good for others feels really, really good, but it also allows us to feel better in our mental health because we feel more socially connected. It also does great things for the person receiving the aid because they feel they're not lost and not acknowledged by the tribe as well. So one of the women in my book that I've interviewed is a lady called Shelley Tagilsky, and she's a CNN hero. And during the pandemic, she set up a mutual aid community called Pandemic of Love. And what Pandemic of Love does, they don't work like a normal charity, they're just the middleman, and they directly connect the person who is giving the aid, a Walmart card, a car, money, whatever it is, to the exact person who needs that aid. And so those people are put into contact, they see each other. It's not just a blind, you give money and you never hear from the person ever again. And what she found was, not only was the donor feeling incredibly good during a time of huge adversity, which was the pandemic, also the donor was able to feel much more socially connected as well. So my question or my action point here really is, have a think right now. When was the last time you gave of your time, no strings attached, to something beyond your family, your direct family? And how could you do it if you haven't? And I would love for you to make this an action point for the next week after the conference. It could be maybe even someone you meet today, new to the industry, who wants mentorship, and you give that time for free. The gifts are incredible. We need to feel we belong to that tribe, and the loneliness and disconnection we're seeing globally as an epidemic is to do with the fact that we live right now in these digital silos. In my part of the world, we're still socially distant, which means every connection is contrived. We're controlling every time we meet or see someone. You have the pleasure here of being wonderfully open in North America. And I wonder if you can take that into account and put that into your diary. So to wrap up the 4 pillars, rapport, that's when other people perceive us to be more like them. Number 2, commonalities connect, living with a mindset of points of relatability, scanning for that in a polarized world. Number 3, vulnerability, putting the human in human connection. And number 4, being of service, living with an others-driven mindset in a self-driven world. If you do all these things, you're going to be not only better in your own mental and physical health, but you're going to be much more memorable to those clients. I know you're all already super top achievers as it is, but super top achievers, I know, with type A personalities, you also just want to be getting better all the time. And human connection could be that missing piece. The very final 3 points I want to leave you with today is also through a story. We've talked a lot about Dad the shopkeeper. I want to talk to you now about my mum. My mum was a teacher at Singapore's most elite girls' school, and the country has an education system not to be laughed at. They take education very seriously where I come from. And so she had a role in mentoring some of the nation's most vibrant, dynamic female minds, women who are now like CFOs, they are engineers who built our subway system. And when I first started speaking back in 2018, the very first paid gig I ever got was for International Women's Day. So this is kind of like an Oprah full circle moment because IWD is tomorrow. And they wanted me to showcase leading women. And I was in radio. I didn't know any corporate women. So I called my mum up, and she's sitting there in her wheelchair in the nursing home in Australia. She's holding the phone with her remaining good hand. And I said, Mama, can I have the name of the woman who's the CFO of that big bank? I want to do some research. And she pauses, and she says, Simone, I am just so proud of them. And I was like, Mum, I'm glad you're proud, but I need names for my speech. So what about the woman who is a surgeon and saves people's lives? And she pauses, this time for a little bit longer. She says, Simone, I'm so proud of them. And at this point, I'm getting sassy. So I'm like, I'm really glad you're proud, Mum, but I really need names for my speech. What about the woman who's the engineer and helped build our subway, our MRT? And this time, my mother pauses for an inordinate amount of time until I realize that she's ashamed because she cannot remember their names. And this is one of the big takeaways that I want to leave you with on human connection. Yes, it's really important that you make great money. It's really important that you have an abundant life. But on human connection terms, those worldly achievements, they don't mean that much at all. It's like what Maya Angelou says, it's all about how you made people feel. The experience of mentoring and teaching those girls filled my mum with unforgettable pride, set her on fire. And it was reciprocal. Because 40 years later, those same busy women, pre-pandemic, would fly on their annual leave thousands of kilometers to visit her in that nursing home in Australia. I mean, I don't even remember my high school teachers' names. So the fact that they were also profoundly touched by how she made them feel is incredible. So it's all about how you make people feel. Number two, reciprocity. How do we know if a connection becomes authentic? Well, it won't be you chasing one way all the time. It was that feeling of reciprocity that she never forgot them, but they never forgot her. So look for reciprocity if you're ever doubting a connection in your life. It doesn't feel right. And lastly, yes, human connection, it's vital to your work. Human connection is so important to that physical and mental health. I'll say it again. But human connection is your legacy. It's how you will be remembered at the end of your life. And I know this because 10 years after that story that I mentioned at the beginning with my dad, 10 years later, the beads of gravel unfurled around the tires of another vehicle into that shopping center car park. And it was the hearse on the morning of my dad's funeral. Because Dad worked all the time, Mum thought, oh, good idea, we should follow his daily route from the house to the office and then to the church. And I looked up with my pimply 19-year-old face against the window of the car, and there was his Malaysian customer, his German customer, and his British customer, all coming to pay tribute to the man that was their local shopkeeper. Human connection, it's your legacy. It's how you'll be remembered. I'm Simone Heng. I collect stories of human connection. If you have any, feel free to write to me. Let's connect.